You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining The American Revolution. This week, episode 388, The Age of Reason. Now, most of us remember Thomas Paine for his writings at the beginning of the Revolutionary War, Common Sense and The Crisis, both of which were published in 1776, but Paine had a whole interesting life after that. As we move through 1794 and 1795, Paine published another one of his major works, The Age of Reason. I thought this would be a good time to catch up with what he's been doing. Early in the American Revolution, Paine was a radical's radical. He was among the first to call for independence publicly and doing away with the monarchy entirely. His writings also pushed for the abolition of slavery, universal male suffrage, public education, public housing, employment assistance, a progressive income tax, Social Security, and many other reforms that would take generations to see the light of day. Paine also did not let personal relationships get in the way of good policy. In 1778 and 79, Robert Morris and Paine were bitter opponents, fighting over the Silas Deane affair. In late 1779, Paine received an appointment to serve as clerk of the Pennsylvania Assembly. He helped raise money the following year for Morris's Bank of North America, seeing it as a critical step toward financing the war effort. He even donated much of his own salary toward the project. In late October of 1780, he published the 10th installment of his Crisis series. In The Crisis Extraordinary, he called for higher taxes to fund the war effort. He began working much more closely with Morris on financial matters. The two men, who had been bitter opponents, managed to find common ground and work closely together. Also back during the bitter dispute over Silas Deane, Paine had been on the side of men like Richard Henry Lee. Despite their friendship, Paine published an essay called Public Good at the end of 1780, arguing that Western lands belonged to the United States, not Virginia. This created a division between Paine and many leaders from Virginia, including Lee. In early 1781, Paine sailed for France in order to assist in the appeals for more financial assistance from Versailles. His trip was a great success. Paine ended up personally sailing back with a shipload of silver French livres, arriving back in Boston in August of 1781. He organized and carried this money to Philadelphia by wagon, and this gift from King Louis helped fund the Yorktown campaign. Despite all his work in finance, Paine was also always broke. Anytime he made any money, he donated it to the cause. As the war wound down in 1782, Robert Morris, along with George Washington and Robert Livingston, helped Paine to get a job writing articles to raise public support for more taxes to keep the war effort going. In 1783, he wrote his 13th and final installment of the Crisis series, beginning this one with, "The times that tried men's souls are over, and the greatest and completest revolution the world ever knew is gloriously and happily accomplished." His essay continued in a way that would make the most conservative Federalists proud, calling for a more secure union and paying off all the war debts. Following the war, though, Paine turned away from politics. Instead, he hoped to focus on science and working on some new inventions. He began working on a new type of single-arched iron bridge, as well as a smokeless candle. Unlike many patriots who had also sacrificed so much for the war effort, Paine managed to receive considerable rewards for his work. New York, grateful for Paine's wartime efforts, gave him a 277-acre farm in New Rochelle. The property had been confiscated from a loyalist named Frederick Devoe and was valued at over 1,100 pounds sterling. In addition, Pennsylvania awarded him another 500 pounds sterling in cash, and the Confederation Congress gave him $3,000. Paine continued to write on behalf of some Federalist causes. In 1786, he published Dissertations on Government, which defended the Bank of North America. He didn't stick around for debate over the Constitution, though. In April of 1787, Paine sailed for France. His goal in going there was that he wanted the French Academy of Science to approve his design for a single-arched iron bridge. His design would make bridge building much easier. After receiving approval, he then sailed to London to visit his mother. You might think that British officials would take offense at a returning subject who had written so many works against the king. Many of his writings would be considered treason under British law. But officials didn't seem to mind his presence. Paine remained in Britain for several years, helping to build several of his iron-arched bridges. And it's not like Paine kept a low profile either. While he was there, he published Prospects on the Rubicon, calling on Britain to avoid a war with France. While his opinions received criticism, the government took no action against him. Conservative politician Edmund Burke even invited Paine to visit his estate. The two men spent over a week together discussing a whole range of things and parted as friends. When the French Revolution began in 1789, Paine crossed the Channel to get involved there. After the fall of the Bastille, Lafayette gave Paine the key to the Bastille to carry it to George Washington as a symbol of the revolution. The French Revolution turned Paine back to his radical ways. His old friend Edmund Burke wrote an essay critical of the French Revolution, and Paine responded by writing his book, The Rights of Man. In it, Paine fleshed out many of his radical views, calling for an end to hereditary power, praising the benefits of a representative republic, and advocating for a welfare state to help the working class benefit more from society's productivity. His book sold over 1.5 million copies in Britain alone. Paine's attacks on monarchy did not differ greatly from his earlier writings in America, but this time officials decided that his publications were going a little too far. Getting Americans to dump the king was one thing. Encouraging British subjects in England to do the same was quite another. King George released a proclamation against seditious writings, and prosecutors charged Paine with sedition. Prosecutors explicitly targeted his notions that all hereditary government is by its very nature tyranny, since people living today have no say over who governs them. Prosecutors issued an indictment in the spring of 1792, but the trial was delayed until December. In the meantime, revolutionaries in France thought much better of Paine's ideas, so much so that they elected the Englishman to the French Convention. Paine gave the matter careful thought as to his options and decided that serving as a French legislator would be better than rotting in a British prison for sedition. He fled the country in September and sailed over to France. The British held his trial anyway. He was convicted of sedition in absentia and declared an outlaw. Jingoists held up Paine as a despicable character, leading him to be burned in effigy in towns all across Britain. In France, though, he received a hero's welcome. He represented Calais because, well, why not? On his first full day at the convention, Paine joined a unanimous vote to abolish the French monarchy and establish a republic. Now keep in mind that King Louis was still alive at this point, so the next step for the convention was to put Louis on trial for the conspiracy of kings against liberty. While Paine went along with finding Louis guilty, he also voted against the death penalty. Instead, he argued that Louis should be imprisoned and later banished to the United States. Killing him would alienate Americans who still held gratitude for the king's support of the American Revolution. Despite his pleas, the convention sent Louis to the guillotine. But Paine's arguments against the execution made him a target of the radicals. At the end of 1793, the Jacobins took power in the convention, and one of the first things they did was vote to exclude all foreigners from the convention. This was clearly directed at Paine. A few days later, they ordered Paine arrested and threw him in prison. This was an especially bad time to be in a French prison. The Reign of Terror had just begun, meaning that thousands were being sent to the guillotines for the smallest of infractions. One might have thought that Paine being a hero of the American Revolution might help him. France was still trying to get the U.S. to join France in the European War on Monarchy. The American minister in France, Gouverneur Morris, who never liked Paine, told French officials that Paine was not an American citizen and that the U.S. was not seeking any special protections for him. As a result, Paine was marked for death, literally. Officials wanted a purge of all the political prisoners in the Luxembourg prison where Paine was being held. They put a chalk mark on the cell doors of all prisoners who would be executed the following day. Paine's door received the check mark for execution. Fortunately for Paine, his door was wide open when the guy with the chalk came by. He put the chalk mark on the door, but after the door was closed, the mark was on the inside. People collecting the prisoners for execution the following morning did not see it and simply passed by his cell. This mistake might have been corrected after officials discovered that Paine was still attached to his head, but Paine then fell ill with a high fever, which rendered him nearly unconscious. Officials delayed bringing him before the Revolutionary Tribunal because he was apparently too sick to be executed. Paine's imprisonment finally ended after about 10 months. Gouverneur Morris was recalled, and James Monroe took his place as the U.S. Minister to France. Unlike Morris, Monroe declared that Paine was an American citizen and that he was a hero of the American Revolution. He told officials that the U.S. would be grateful if they showed leniency with Paine. Also by this time, the Reign of Terror had ended. Its architect, Maximilien Robespierre, had been introduced to the guillotine himself. Officials released Paine in November of 1794, and a month later, they actually invited him to return to his seat at the convention. Paine went back to arguing for a true republic. His final speech came in July of 1795, when he argued against limiting voting rights to property owners. Shortly after that, the convention dissolved, and Paine was not elected to the new convention. Prison, however, had taken its toll. In addition to helping him get released, Monroe opened up his home to Paine for his recovery. Paine was still suffering from the diseases that he had contracted in prison. He lived in Monroe's home and under Monroe's care for about a year and a half. Monroe covered all of his food and medical costs. It must have been quite a turn of events to go from the conditions of prisoner to the luxury of the residence of the U.S. ambassador at La Folie de la Bauxière. Paine used this time not only to recover, but also to complete his work called The Age of Reason. Eventually, Paine would leave the care of the U.S. ambassador. Paine ended up writing a vicious public letter condemning President Washington for letting Paine rot in a French prison for so long. Following publication of that letter, Ambassador Monroe decided it would be better if Paine found another place to live. Paine told friends that his survival of the Reign of Terror wasn't just luck, but that it was the hand of Providence that must have been involved. If that was true, Paine decided to bite the hand that fed him by publishing The Age of Reason. Paine had actually begun writing this book before he went to prison. There's some evidence that he had been working on it for years. He dropped off part one of the work with his friend for safekeeping, as he was literally on his way to prison. He wrote some of part two while in prison, with the remainder written after his release. The Age of Reason covered Paine's views on religion. Paine considered himself to be a deist. Some people think that deism is a lack of belief in God. It really isn't. Paine begins his book by stating that he believes in one God and that it is the duty of all men to do justice, to love, and to show mercy to one another. From there, Paine announced that he opposed all organized religions, saying that they are human inventions designed to terrify and enslave mankind so that political leaders could monopolize power for themselves. He argues that even if God would reveal messages to a particular person, there is no way for other people to verify that. His attacks on religious leaders were just as brutal as his earlier attacks on aristocracy. His book continues by denying the divinity of Jesus. Paine claims that while Jesus taught a benevolent morality, the miracles and other fables associated with Jesus were written by others many centuries later. Christian mythology, he argued, is actually a composite of stories found in earlier heathen religions. Instead, Paine finds the proof of God in the miracles of nature. The vast universe that supports mankind and gives us reason is what Paine reveres. He declares, quote, "My own mind is my own church." God is the creator of all things that make life possible. He notes the vastness of the universe, making the focus on our tiny planet Kind of ridiculous. Paine focuses on how organized religion keeps us from understanding God's creation. The Church's use of dead languages and the persecution of scientists like Galileo are evidence of this. He identifies the use of mystery, miracle, and prophecy as tools used to impose religion and keep us from truly understanding God. Part 2 of his book is a detailed look at each book in the Old and New Testaments, critiquing the stories and pointing out the historical contradictions to prove that these stories were made up by religious leaders long after the fact. Paine concludes his work by reaffirming his view that only rational belief and reason can help us to understand God through understanding science and the universe. It is only through the freedom of opinion and the use of reason that truth will eventually prevail. Now, from the very beginning, Paine's attack on religion was not received well. It's probably not surprising that some of the most brutal reactions came from Great Britain, where Paine was already considered an outlaw and a crazed radical for rejecting monarchy and aristocracy. The author was out of the reach of British authorities, but several people who published or sold the book were prosecuted for blasphemous libel. One of the lawyers who aided the prosecution, Thomas Erskine, was the same lawyer who had defended Paine for writing The Rights of Man. Before the government suppressed the work, printers had made and sold thousands of copies in Britain, and these continued to circulate among British readers. The British clergy also roundly condemned the work from the pulpit. There were at least 36 formal answers that were also published by various defenders of organized religion. The most famous was probably Bishop Richard Watson's Apology for the Bible. Watson warned potential readers that Paine would, quote, unsettle the faith of thousands and lead to public insecurity. At the same time, though, he noted that some of Paine's criticisms of some biblical passages seemed to have some merit. The response to the book in America was similarly hostile. Paine printed 15,000 copies of his book in Paris and shipped them to Benjamin Franklin Bache for sale in America. Although the federal government didn't ban the book, it was roundly attacked and very unpopular. Political radicals who had favored Paine's earlier writings that attacked efforts by the aristocracy to limit our freedom balked at Paine's similar criticisms of organized religion. Once again, people who had associations with Paine tended to pay the price for his controversy. Federalists used Thomas Jefferson's association with Paine to attack Jefferson, and Jefferson would eventually have to publicly distance himself from Paine's ideas, although he didn't reject Paine personally. Others were not so kind. Benjamin Rush had been very close with Paine from the time Paine first arrived in America before the Revolutionary War began. Rush even refused to meet with Paine when he returned to America many years later. Other radicals who had used Paine's earlier works to further the Revolution also turned on him. Samuel Adams proclaimed astonishment that Paine had turned his mind to a, quote, defense of infidelity. Even the French reception of the book was mixed. Paine had written his book in English, but his friend translated and published a French version of Part 1 at least in 1793, while Paine was still in prison. The radical Jacobin government favored atheism, and they objected to the book. The government effectively suppressed this early version of the book. Paine even said that one intention of him writing the book was to prevent people from accepting atheism. He believed that deism made more sense. This position drew criticism from both radical atheists as well as the conservatives who still favored some version of organized religion. The radical atheists believed that even deism, which accepted a belief in God, could be used to justify monarchy. Following Paine's release from prison and the end of the Reign of Terror, French intelligentsia began to warm up to some of Paine's ideas. Robespierre had attempted to replace French Catholicism with the cult of the supreme being in France. This seemed to be very compatible with Paine's ideas. It eventually gave rise to theophilanthropy as a religious replacement for Catholicism. Theophilanthropy is loosely translated from the Greek as friends of God and man. Its adherents accepted the existence of God and the immortality of the soul, but rejected traditional theology. Instead, principles of behavior were based on rationalism and utilitarian morality. In January of 1797, Paine helped launch the first church of theophilanthropy at the former Church of St. Catherine in Paris. He gave the inaugural address for the new religion with only 5 families in attendance. He put forward that theology should be combined with scientific instruction. Learning how the universe works was the closest that we could come to the hand of God in its creation. Next week, we're going to return to the war in Ohio as General Mad Anthony Wayne fights the Battle of Fallen Timbers. Hey, thanks for joining the American Revolution Podcast After Show, part of the Airwave Media Network. Thanks to my Patreon supporters in the Alexander Hamilton Club, George Davis and Gordon Kemp. Thanks to Robert Morris Circle supporters Keith Mello and Patrick LeBeau. And welcome to new Privy Council members on Patreon, Aaron Wolf, as well as our newest supporter at the Standard Bearer level, Robert Wilgus. I also want to thank Derek Disbrow for a generous one-time gift via PayPal. This week we covered Thomas Paine's role in the French Revolution. Other than the Marquis de Lafayette, I don't think anyone played such a pivotal role in both revolutions. Personally, I've always been fascinated by Paine's writings. I read all of his books when I was in college, even though most were not assigned reading for me. The fact that this man from the 18th century had so many ideas that are still trying to gain traction 250 years later just fascinates me. Before we get into that, I do have one correction to make. In one of the very early episodes for this podcast, I passed along some information that I had read. The conventional wisdom for many years was that Paine's early career growing up as a stay maker was making stays for women's corsets. I read several sources that said this was wrong, that he actually made rope stays for ships. I accepted this new information and passed it along in my podcast. Someone recently asked me about that, which caused me to go back and look at the question again. At the time I originally commented on this, I figured the new information would be substantiated and added to the history books. That didn't happen. And in fact, I haven't really been able to find a good primary source which actually confirms this supposed new information. I also found a compelling article by J.L. Bell, who runs the Boston 1775 blog, that directly challenges new information as not having any credible source and gives several reasons why he thinks the story about Paine making stays for corsets is the correct one. I really respect Bell, and I have good reason to accept his arguments. While there's no certain proof either way on this question, I'm more inclined today to believe that the stays for corsets background for Thomas Paine was the correct one and not that he made ship stays. I do strive for accuracy, but I have inevitably made some mistakes, and I think this is one of them. I certainly would not make this same assertion today that I did in the podcast so many years ago. So, for what it's worth, that's my view on this controversy as it stands today. I also wanted to discuss a bit more about the religion that Paine had founded. Paine's new religion, theophilanthropy, eventually opened more than 19 churches around Paris, and Paine remained an important revolutionary voice in France. While Napoleon was trying to take power, he tried to make friends with Paine, even inviting him to dinner. And Napoleon told Paine that he slept with a copy of The Rights of Man under his pillow, and that Paine deserved to have a statue of gold built for him in every city. Paine even collaborated with Napoleon on planning a possible invasion of England. After Napoleon seized power in 1799, however, the relationship changed. Paine criticized Napoleon, who shut down and imprisoned newspaper editors who disagreed with him. Napoleon also reached an agreement with Pope Pius in 1801 that resulted in shutting down all the theophilanthropy services, and 2 years later, the religion was banned entirely in France. Paine received warnings that he was under government surveillance and might be deported. So, in 1802, Paine decided that his time in France was over. He proclaimed that Napoleon was a charlatan and that France was no longer a country for an honest man to live in. Paine's religion of theophilanthropy had gained some adherents in America. There were organizations in New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, but the general consensus of most Americans was that Paine's rejection of Christianity was unacceptable. Most of his former friends refused to meet with him. Some tavern owners refused to serve him. One Federalist editor called him a, quote, lying, drunken, brutal infidel. In 1806, Paine tried to vote at his home in New Rochelle, and the election officials refused to allow him to vote. They claimed that his election to the French Convention had ended his American citizenship. Paine sued, demanding his right to vote as an American citizen. This lawsuit went on for years and was not resolved before Paine's death in 1809. Even in death, Paine's works caused problems for him. Religious leaders refused to allow him burial in the Quaker cemetery near his farm in New York. Instead, he was buried on his farm in a small and relatively unattended funeral. 10 years later, a supporter dug up his body and took it to England. He intended to build a grand monument to Paine, but that never happened. Instead, Paine's body was lost, and its whereabouts are unknown to this day. After his death, many of Paine's works, including The Rights of Man and The Age of Reason, became required reading among English radicals. They became an important pillar of the movement for political reform in Britain and the movement for religious liberty. My book recommendation this week is Man of Reason, The Life of Thomas Paine by Alfred Aldrich. There are many really good biographies about Paine out there, but most give undue focus to his Revolutionary War years. I like this one because it gives more equal time to his work in the French Revolution as well. This is an older book, first published in 1959. There is also a borrow-only copy on archive.org if you just want to take a look at it. But if you want to read more about this man's fascinating life, get Man of Reason, The Life of Thomas Paine by Alfred Aldrich. My online recommendation is get a copy of Paine's book, The Age of Reason. It's always best to read the original text of these ideas. I think many of his thoughts on God and organized religion are still relevant today. Even if you don't agree with everything he says, it is an interesting and valid perspective. The book, of course, is in the public domain and is available for download from many sources. As always, I've included a direct link to the book on my blog and in the show notes. My question this week asks, what specific campaigns or battles did Spain participate in during the American Revolution, and why are they not as famous as those involving France? Well, the main thing is that Spain did not play any active role in any American Revolution campaigns or battles. The American Revolution was the struggle by the 13 colonies/states that broke away from Britain and formed the United States. The wartime struggle that lasted from 1775 to 1783. Now, during that time, Spain never allied itself with the United States, nor did it send any of its army or navy to assist directly in that struggle. France joined the fight in 1778. It sent naval forces that played a role in an attempt to push the British out of Rhode Island and another to push them out of Savannah, working side by side with Continental forces. Later in the war, France sent a small army to Rhode Island, and that army, along with the French Navy, participated in the Yorktown campaign, also cooperating side by side with the Continentals. Spain was not involved in any of that. Spain did go to war with Britain in 1779, at the very strong urging of its traditional ally, France. Spain's primary goal was to capture Gibraltar at a time when it thought Britain was weakened by the other fights. Most of Spain's activity during the war took place in other parts of the world. There was fighting over colonies in the West Indies and in Latin America. Spain captured the Mediterranean island of Minorca and besieged British defenses at Gibraltar. Spain also launched attacks from New Orleans and what was called West Florida. This resulted in the capture of Baton Rouge and the area around what is today Mobile, Alabama, and Pensacola, Florida. Spain also maintained a small presence in what is today St. Louis, Missouri, fending off British-inspired Indian attacks, and making sure that fighting did not expand into areas west of the Mississippi River. None of these areas were fighting for independence or seeking to become part of the United States at the time. Therefore, I don't consider them part of the American Revolution. Spanish King Carlos gave his military commanders strict orders not to fight alongside Americans or do anything that would recognize U.S. independence. Spain's war with Britain at the time was fought to assist France only and hopefully benefit from British weakness by capturing a few colonial areas that were controlled by Spain. Now, Spain did provide some critical financial support to the American Revolution, although most of that support was sent through France. I should note that France also engaged with Britain in other parts of the world, including in the West Indies and in India, and we don't pay much attention to those battles either. The French involvement that gets the most attention from American history is when France fought alongside the Americans, and Spain just never did that. If you have a question you'd like me to answer, please reach out to me either via email or on X, Facebook, Quora, or Reddit. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you will join me again next week for another American Revolution podcast.